let's go ahead and start with introductions. Professor Davis received a BA in political science from BYU in, well, not 2 years, and a master's in mass communications from BYU, and then went on to get a master's and a PhD from Syracuse University. He was recently involved with the publication of Presidential Communication in the Internet era in the Presidential Studies Quarterly, and press coverage of the United States Supreme Court in media power and media politics. Paul Skousen is the seventh child of Cleon and Jewel Skousen, is a former CIA analyst and intelligence officer at the Reagan White House. He received his BA from BYU in Communications and Journalism and a master's at Georgetown in National Security Studies. He has worked in the corporate and print communications all his adult career and wrote the Skousen Book of Mormon World Records and its sequel, Brother Paul's Mormon Bathroom Reader. He is the father of 10 children and resides in Alpine, Utah, and is just beginning the research for the biography of Cleon Skousen. Ralph Hancock has taught political philosophy at BYU for 22 years. His research examines the claims of modern reason in relation to moral and religious beliefs. He's also the president of the John Adams Center for the Study of Faith, Philosophy, and Public Affairs, which is an independent educational foundation. And Professor Midgley is a retired professor of political science at BYU. Since his retirement, he's been closely involved with the Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies, writing many book reviews, articles, and book chapters defending the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints from critics. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of Utah and holds a PhD from Brown University. Following his retirement, Midgley and his wife served as the church education system missionaries in New Zealand. So with that, we'll let them get started.
Well, thank you for the invitation to participate in this panel. Let me begin by relating just an incident that happened a little while ago when I was in my class and talking about this panel and encouraging students to come to it. Although I don't see any of my students here. There we go. Okay. That's a former student here. Yeah. When I announced this and said Glenn Beck and Cleon Skousen and Conservatism, one of the students raised his hand and said, "Well, I don't understand. What did Glenn Beck and Cleon Skousen have in common with each other? Wasn't Cleon Skousen a general authority?" Not so. But I think there's probably some confusion there, and we'll bring that out in the course of this session, about the relationship between Glenn Beck and Cleon Skousen. But I'm supposed to talk about first kind of the context of Glenn Beck's rise to prominence. And in order to do that, I kind of need to talk beyond Glenn Beck and talk about the media and talk about how the media shape politics today. You have to go back to a decision by the Federal Communications Commission in 1986 to end what was called the Fairness Doctrine. And the Fairness Doctrine said that if a broadcaster was to air one side of an issue, they needed to air the other side. This was very controversial for broadcasters. They hated it. And they often tried to avoid even talking about politics and controversial issues because they were afraid that they would then have to give time to some other group, and that was their time that they felt they owned. So they worked very hard to end this, and they succeeded in 1986. And as a result, broadcasting was essentially free from those restraints. And that's why you get the talk radio rise and television talk, and why you get Fox News, because they don't have to provide both sides anymore. And so Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity and Glenn Beck have come out of that decision and have been able to do pretty much what they want to do, as long as they're the owners of the broadcast facilities go along with them. And this has been true not just with talk radio, but also television talk. It is also, I think, animated partisans. I don't mean by partisans just Democrats or Republicans, but ideological partisans, allowing them to be able to have a particular viewpoint hammered home, even a particular channel that is just dedicated to their particular views. And that's what we're seeing right now. And Glenn Beck is part of that. Interestingly enough, Glenn Beck used to be on CNN, not on Fox News, which had to be somewhat confusing to some CNN viewers. Why is he here? Now he's moved over and he's become much more popular. I mean, the conservatives probably they weren't watching CNN and wondering, I don't know who Glenn Beck is. Now they know definitely who Glenn Beck is. He is also on radio. He has about 8 million listeners on his radio program. 400 radio stations around the country have Glenn Beck. He is the top-rated host on Fox News. He has the top-selling books in the nation, bestsellers. This guy has become a media phenomenon. And not only that, but these talk show hosts have combined that media presence with other things like speeches around the country. Glenn Beck actually does kind of performances around the country, sells his books at the same time. So here you have this guy, Glenn Beck, who is also LDS, a convert to the church, talking to a conservative audience. What does he say to them? What kind of information does he provide? He's got some sort of vague views about government, and I think in this kind of context, he is exposed to Cleon Skousen. Now, why would that be attractive? Why would Cleon Skousen be attractive to Glenn Beck? First, Glenn Beck's LDS, Cleon Skousen LDS. There's the connection there. Also, Cleon Skousen, I think, was the most prolific political writer in the church. And so it's easy for people to assume that that's kind of Mormon political doctrine, is Cleon Skousen's views about politics. And I think that that's one reason why Glenn Beck has been attracted to him. Glenn Beck, I think, had these sort of vague notions about populism and about how bad government was and how the nation had deteriorated from what the framers intended. But Cleon Skousen, I think, fleshed that out for him, the views that he was seeing in Skousen's books. Also, I think that what you see is Skousen's connection to church leaders. I mean, President McKay actually endorsed the naked communist in conference, in general conference. And I mean, not only did he reference it, but he said all members ought to read this wonderful book. So clearly people were saying, well, Cleon Skousen's theories and views must be the views that I should hold as a church member. And so Glenn Beck is picking up on this. 40 years ago, when Cleon Skousen was writing, you didn't have talk radio. You didn't have television talk in the way that we do now because of the fairness doctrine. But my guess is, had we had that, Cleon Skousen would have used those mechanisms and become somewhat like Glenn Beck in that sense. I think there's a significant difference, though, between Glenn Beck and Cleon Skousen that needs to be talked about. And one is, I think, the intellectual heft of the two. Cleon Skousen's books are, footnoted. We might take issue as to, how accurate it all is, but I think he attempted very much to provide that kind of research accuracy. Glenn Beck doesn't really do that, and I don't think his audience expects him to really do as much of that. I think another is that the tone of discourse. When Glenn Beck speaks, there is clearly a fear factor here. In fact, he calls his studio the doom room. He says, "I'm afraid, and you should be afraid too." He feeds an anger, and I don't get that from Cleon Skousen. Sort of an anger. Maybe you can correct me, Paul, but I don't get that. But certainly it's there with Glenn Beck. It's part of the shtick to stir people's emotions through anger. Also, I see ad hominem attacks by Beck that don't see with Skousen. I mean, to say that Obama has a deep-seated hatred for white people, that's something that, you know, is characteristic, not just of Beck, and I want to be fair here, not just of Beck, but actually of sort of talk show hosts generally, today, left or right. You have that kind of ad hominem approach. And I wanted to contrast that with some statements recently. Elder Wood, General Conference, April 2006, and you had Elder Wood here just a little while ago. He says, "It is far too easy sometimes to fall into a spirit of mockery and cynicism in dealing with those of contrary views. We demoralize or demean so as to bring others or their ideas in contempt. It is a primary tool of those who occupy the large and spacious building that Father Lehi saw in vision. Jude, the brother of Christ, warned that there should be mockers in the last time who should walk after their own ungodly lust. These be they who separate themselves sensual, having not the Spirit." President Monson, talking about anger, you know, was he directed this to Glenn Beck? I'm not sure, but I think he was warning us about becoming those, you know, what Beck talks about, these white angry men here. He says, "We've all felt anger. It can come when things don't turn out the way we want. It might be a reaction to something which is said of us or to us. We may experience it when people don't behave the way we want them to behave. Perhaps it comes when we have to wait for something longer than we expected. We might feel angry when others can't see things from our perspective." He says, "To be angry is to yield to the influence of Satan. No one can make us angry. It's our choice. If we desire to have a proper spirit with us at all times, we must choose to refrain from becoming angry. I testify that such is possible." So that's one of my concerns about. I think a significant difference, I think, between, and you know, he's using Cleon Skousen's views, but I think his approach is quite different from what Cleon Skousen's approach was. And I think that differentiates Glenn Beck from Cleon Skousen. So.
Well, let me say something about the term ad hominem. We've gotten in the habit. This is supposedly a fallacy. That is a fallacy in reasoning. But an insult isn't an argument. And it can't be an ad hominem, because an ad hominem, if it means anything, it means an argument. An insult or a description by itself isn't an argument. It's just that. If I were to say that person can't be a geologist because he's Jewish, that would be an ad hominem. It's an argument. Or that person can't be a competent historian because they're a Latter-day Saint. That would be an ad hominem. But to say that person that dwarf is short might be an insult, but it isn't an ad hominem. Some of what this is with Beck, from what little I know of him from having watched him a few times, is that he's a skilled performer where he's funny, clever, demeaning, insulting, and so on. But often there are no arguments. They're not ad hominems. They're just insults and as we've heard, an appeal to fear. Now I'm sitting here next to the son of Cleon Skousen, and I am probably as well known for being an opponent of Cleon Skousen's political views as anyone anywhere. I thought his book.
That's why you get paid the big bucks to be here.
Yeah, I thought his book, The Naked Communist, was very poorly done. Now this, I mean by that, he didn't know the current literature, and he didn't set out decent arguments, and it misled Latter-day Saints by simply being a poor book. Now I won't try and argue that here. That's in print. although the material that I prepared had been lifted from me by Richard Paul and published as a little pamphlet with his own spin on it, which is interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah, it's true. Stan Taylor, who used to teach in this department, I don't know whether any of you know him, he used to teach research and writing, and he used the Naked Communist as an example of how not to write, to teach students in the political science department how not to do research and write because of the host of mistakes in it. Now, this is, from my point of view, what an academic should be doing for the thing. Now, I know he got an endorsement from President McKay, but I'm not sure that President McKay read the book or was in a position to make an informed judgment on it. But now the other book I'll comment on is The Naked Capitalist. Now, this isn't just a poor book. This is a terrible book. He picked up the idea. He wasn't original with him. He picked it up from others who had discovered in a huge 1,000-page American history textbook. Can you think of anything more boring than a 1,000-page American history textbook? He found in one portion of it that Carroll Quigley had some comments about the interrelationship between banks and the State Department, personnel in the State Department that were on the China desk, and the 5 or 6 universities that had scholars that worked on Chinese politics or Chinese history. And if you're in the State Department one administration, you're back at Georgetown the next. And you need funding for your research, and banks gave it, and so on and so forth. And he looked at this. Quigley had looked at this, and Cleon didn't invent this. He had picked up the idea that this was the revelation of an enormous bankers' conspiracy that runs the world. That is, in Wall Street and London, everything that goes on. If a country has an election and something goes wrong, or there's an overthrow of a government, or somebody is put in a position in a government, everything that goes on was day by day, moment by moment, dictated by a banker's conspiracy. The only thing that this kind of banker's conspiracy has a history, that kind of conspiracy theory, only it's usually Jewish bankers. Now, Cleon wasn't anti-Semitic at all, and he didn't do that, but of course the people he was talking about were, in both London and Wall Street, often Jewish. And this appealed to a certain population, and it annoyed me greatly because I considered it total rubbish. Now, Glenn Beck hasn't picked up on that stuff. He's picked up on another angle. Foursquare, the Constitution, and that would appeal to a Latter-day Saint. A Latter-day Saint, Beck joined the church, but how much does he know about it? How solidly informed is he on our history and so on, and all of the differences of opinions that float around in the Latter-day Saint community? I'm not sure there was much of that. And it's easy for me to see why he would have picked up on one of Cleon Skousen's books and found it inspiring, and something that would fit in with his own performance. Richard used a little different term for it, but it's, yeah. All right, but I don't think we're here to talk about that sort of thing, and I hope you don't get involved in that. That isn't what a university's for, to get involved in this kind of partisan, low-level, trailer park ideology. And if you think that the world is, that you can divide the world up into liberals and conservatives, you ought to know something about those terms. Let me read to you something. This is from the preface to a book by Leo Strauss called Liberalism, Ancient and Modern. Now, it's an old book. I'll give you the date, 1968. He says, the opposition between conservatism and liberalism had a clear meaning at the time at which and in the place in which it arose in these terms. Do you know what conservatism, when that word was first used to describe a political ideology, what was it describing? Do any of you know? Well, if you don't, you'll learn something right now. Strauss says, then and there, back when it came on the scene, the word conservative, then and there, the conservatives stood for throne and altar, and that means no bishop, no king. Established church. That's what they were conserving. No king, no bishop. The other side of it. And liberals stood for popular sovereignty and strictly non-public, that is, private character of religion. So, believe it or not, if you think of yourself as a conservative, you're a liberal right to the core now. Did you learn something? That's what universities are for. Don't waste my tithing money. Yet conservatism in this sense is no longer politically important. We've disestablished this. We had state churches up until 1830 in the United States, some states. Half of them when the Constitution was adopted. And we finally got rid of them. The conservatism of our age is identical with what originally was liberalism, more or less modified by changes in the direction of present-day liberalism. One could go further and say that much of what goes now by the name of conservatism has, in the last analysis, a common root with present-day liberalism, and he added, and even communism. They're all the product of the modern world. Well, what was the pre-modern world? A world in which to be liberal, in the original sense, see, the opposite of liberal isn't conservative, it's unliberal, whatever liberal means. What did liberal mean? Well, what he says is that it meant the practice and or seeking virtue. Now, that's a word that's almost gone out of fashion now. What it means for us is, does she or doesn't she? Or will she or won't she? But you can cheat on your income tax and you're perfectly virtuous. See? You can cheat people in business. You can lie to your professors about why you didn't get your paper in or whatever, and you're still virtuous because you don't do that. But virtue once had a far deeper and richer meaning, and a reasonable liberalism or conservatism in the pre-modern sense would have been grounded and should be grounded in the attainment of virtue. So the genuinely liberal man is identical with the genuinely virtuous man, but not understood the way we understand these words. His other comments, I'll read a few of them. He says, liberals regard as sacred the right of everyone, however humble, odd, or inarticulate, to criticize the government, including the man at the top. But so do conservatives. Does Glenn Beck criticize Barack Obama? In that they share the same ideology, don't they? Should we put a lid on criticizing the man at the top? How do we distinguish between the two? Well, it's whether it's your man or not, see. And then it becomes all the strange things about how we learn to be Republicans and Democrats, and why we hold those views, which most of us can't sort out. I've been working on this for years, and I still haven't sorted it out. Conservatives regard the universal and homogeneous state as either undesirable, though possible, or as both undesirable and impossible. Now, I think it's both undesirable but possible. I don't want to be shoehorned into one mold. And you don't either, because I assume that you want to be Latter-day Saints and not just secular humanists of some approved stamp from that the secular regime has put upon us. Conservatives look with greater sympathy than liberals on the particular or particularist and the heterogeneous. And I certainly do, because if you're a Latter-day Saint, you are particular, and you stand out and you differ. So you want protection for your difference. You don't want to be homogenized. Conservatism is frequently characterized by distrust of reason or by trust in tradition, which as such is necessarily this or that tradition and hence particular. Distrust of reason? Yes, there are some very good rational arguments for being cautious about what you think you can figure out. There is a rational irrationalism, to put it bluntly. That's better than an irrational rationalism. We remain closer to the surface by saying that the conservatives' distrust of the universal and homogeneous state is rooted in their distrust of change. Now, we heard a lot about change recently. Liberals are inclined to believe that on the whole, change is change for the better, or progress, forward steps. Every innovation, every novelty. In fact, nothing good is going on unless there's novelty, new. See, every professor has to be inventing new ideas and publishing new stuff when they don't even know what the old stuff is, and neither do their students. Well, enough, I think. Could we be rationally distrustful of every urge to change, with the fear that we're not taking a step forward necessarily, but maybe a step backward? Now, I've ranted long enough. I'd hope you get a better sense of what it means to be a genuinely liberal person, and hence an appropriately conservative person, by getting rid of political ideologies that are being spread by people who are ranting on the television. And that includes not just one network, that includes all of them.
Thank you, Professor Midgley and all. Thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to be here between my colleagues, including my old teacher, Professor Midgley. And I want to thank in advance Brother Paul Skousen, for whom I had just met, for kindly consenting to be here and to share this panel with us. So let me begin with these confessions. I'm no expert on Glenn Beck, or actually on Cleon Skousen. I've tried to do a little reading in recent weeks, and I'll share some possibilities. Partly, I want to eventually get the audience to speak up a bit and help me to understand to what degree Glenn Beck and or Cleon Skousen are important factors for Latter-day Saints who think of themselves as conservatives. I assume that some of you out there at least might be in that category. Am I an expert on anything? Maybe a bit on conservatism, or rather, perhaps I could claim on a certain conservative intellectual movement. So I'm familiar with authors such as Edmund Burke, John Adams, Alexis de Tocqueville, Russell Kirk, Eric Voegelin, Leo Strauss, from whom Professor Midgley just quoted at some length. That's where I'm coming from, and that's the tradition of inquiry that I am here to tout today. What about the last part of our title, Mormon Conservatism Today? I don't claim to be an expert on that, but some in the audience, again, might provide an interesting, certainly not a random, but an interesting sample. I wonder whether Latter-day Saints who think of themselves as conservative resonate with Glenn Beck. From my sampling in the neighborhood, and in my son's neighborhood, Beck has a considerable resonance. And I don't know how much of this derives from the fact that he has let us know that he is a Latter-day Saint. And what about his recent touting of Cleon Skousen, who was, as Professor Midgley has helped us see, was a household word. Certainly when I was going to say when I was your age, but no, it was when I was younger than you, when I was maybe in high school, especially Skousen's The Naked Communist certainly would be on many Latter-day Saint bookshelves, especially, I suppose. When was it touted by President McKay?
1959.
59, that's so. I was just a child then. But so this goes way back, but I wonder, has Beck contributed to anything? Was Skousen still a going concern, or did Glenn Beck make him a going concern again? If you'll help me out, this non-random sample, we can begin to, this unscientific survey, you know, we can begin to get a sense. You a comment, sir? Yes. Yeah, sure.
Okay. I was just thinking, my opinion, Cleon Skousen, I've heard the name, I knew he wrote some political things. That's about all I knew, up until Glenn Beck started kind of using them, things like that.
Okay.
I knew there was a general myth or whatever that he didn't have his facts straight all the time, and that was about it.
Okay. Well, let me, if you don't mind, though, are there a number here who don't mind self-identifying themselves as conservative or leaning conservative? Here, I'll be the first. Okay.
Oh my gosh.
Okay. That's good. Now, how many of you consider Glenn Beck as, and don't be embarrassed, because I'm about to say that he says many things that I agree with, and I think he makes some important points. So I hope you're not bashful just because Professor Davis is here. But how many of you regard him as an important, sort of a guiding light or a touchstone of, or of an important voice that you take your bearings from? Thank you. And now keep your hands raised. And now keep your hands raised if Cleon Skousen has come up on your radar screen and become of some importance to you because of Glenn Beck. Just a few. So it hasn't exactly incited a revival, although I assume Paul would know that some books have been sold, especially this book, as a result of Glenn Beck's touting. Well, you will find me quite ambivalent regarding Mr. Beck and Mr. Skousen. Ambivalent because I find in both more than a trace of anti-intellectualism. My concern, here I think I resonate with my old teacher, unsurprisingly, not that old, but former teacher, that my interest is to help connect a certain Latter-day Saint conservative impulse or mood with a more deeply grounded intellectual conservatism. Now, regarding anti-intellectualism, let me say at the outset that, in a way to paraphrase, even paranoids have real enemies. Well, in the same way, anti-intellectuals are sometimes, actually quite often, right about the corruption of the intellectual class, about the bias of our mainstream experts, including media experts. But this does not alter the fact that anti-intellectualism, I would say, is a self-defeating and ultimately a destructive stance. We can't enter the political field, the public realm, with the argument, all the bad but smart people think X, but we good dumb folks think, why? Or we don't want to say, those people who really know how to explain, defend, and factually support their positions with argument favor side A, but us good ordinary common people favor side B, though we can't give a reasoned account of why anyone should agree with us. I find that self-defeating. This anti-intellectual populist conservatism is inherently self-defeating, and it deserves to be defeated. The anger that Professor Davis has rightly pointed up and castigated deserves to be castigated, and I think it's a sign of intellectual insecurity. People are angry when they can't really figure things out and feel that they are at a loss. But as I implied above, even anti-intellectuals might often be right about many intellectuals, even about contemporary intellectuals as a kind of intellectually ruling class, even if the anti-intellectuals can't exactly explain why, or even if they can't adequately answer all the intellectuals' arguments. I think that Glenn Beck and Cleon Skousen, whom Beck has recently helped regain a certain prominence, are very often right. I'll just, that'll discredit me perhaps with Professor Davis, but I'll say it right up front that I don't know what percentage, but 80 or 90, the particular points they make that are not simply insults, but actual claims of some kind, insofar as I understand them, I might just agree with them. And yet, I have great problems with taking them as sort of lodestars of our conservatism. First of all, I find Beck mostly unwatchable. The shtick, as you say, is just too maudlin, too emotional. He's wearing his feelings so much on his sleeve. He's selling himself so much. I just don't know how seriously to take him, and it tends towards a certain extremism and its entertainment value that I distrust. So I don't know how seriously to take him, or it's hard to say how seriously he really takes himself. He knows he's practiced a shtick. He's making a good dollar, to say the least. He may be very sincere, but it's hard to define where the line is between his salesmanship, his entertainment, and his thinking. Most of the books of Beck's that I've picked up off the shelf, Arguing with Idiots is one. You probably know some of the other titles. I picked up this one, Common Sense. And it's a little, most of the books I say are kind of like his, how shall I say, his manic or ADHD television personality, just kind of just throwing stuff out there. They're meant not to be read as discursive and sustained arguments, but just kind of thrown out there to try to entertain people who would rather be twittering or playing video games or something. Common Sense is at least a partial exception. There are some sustained arguments, and some of them are more or less well-grounded. I mean, it's not a deep philosophical or scholarly book, but it sustains a respectable level of argument in many respects. Here's some things I made a list of things to mention that I really like about it or respond to, and I won't be able to go through the whole list, but let me just show you my sincerity by trying. On page 24, when we place ourselves in debt, we have no one to blame but ourselves, and the same holds true for our country. Our elected officials are to blame, but didn't we vote for them? So, I mean, I think that's an honest impulse. A certain kind of angry populism tends to put the blame on other people so much that we forget that, that the people must somehow be ultimately to blame. On page 44, he recognizes candidly that, at least he cites a poll, I don't know the poll, but it sounds plausible to me, that only what he calls capitalism is a minority preference among those under 30. So it's by no means clear that people agree with Beck's sincere populism. He recognizes that it may be an uphill battle, and that a large swath, at least, of public opinion may actually be contrary to what he's calling common sense. Pages 67 and following, if you want to look at the book, I'll just summarize by saying I think his critique of progressivism, a movement going back to at least the early part of this century, and which in a way came to a culmination in the New Deal, came in a way a kind of qualified victory, I would say, in the New Deal period. This critique draws on serious scholarship, and it's real and important. I think Beck doesn't think nearly enough about if this profound critique of the sort of undermining of the founders' Constitution as they, and I would say Lincoln, understood it, if that's true, where that is really a graver situation than I think Beck fully understands. So in a way, if his diagnosis is true, his prognosis is far too superficial and light, I would say. Enough of I have some more particular points about Beck, but I need to move on and just say, with respect to Cleon Skousen, I haven't reviewed The Naked Communist or The Naked Capitalist. I trust Professor Midgley's judgment about the insufficiency, let's say, of the argument of the Naked Communist. But let me say this, that often now I would not like this to play into what is too often an assumption from those of you educated recently in our high schools, that what we know mainly about communism today is that there was this crazy guy McCarthy in the 50s, and he got all bent out of shape for no particular reason, and so that anti-communism was just stupid. You know, it's really not that simple. There may be a stupid anti-communist, and it may yet be the case that communism was actually a real problem that killed scores of millions of people, and that it actually had a presence in the United States, and there really was something to be concerned about. That may all be true, and yet there may yet be stupid anti-communist arguments. So I wouldn't want to give any aid and comfort to the anti-communists who have basically defined our public education in recent decades. I've made a little study of the book that Beck recommends, The 5,000-Year Leap, and I find it, in a way, a collection of quotations that has a lot of good quotations, and many of them I resonate with. But it's really, as an argument, it's not one. It's a mishmash of references and of fragments of arguments that don't really cohere. A list of principles without orderly synthetic argument. Now, I find a lot of quotations and principles that I like. In fact, that I think would be important to a sustained argument defending a conservative view of America's meaning. But there's no argument. The framework is simplistic and one-dimensional. This is a little hasty, but I just have to leave it at that. I can give more examples as requested. As I looked at Brother Skousen's preface, I think I found an explanation for the limitations that I found in this book. There he describes in an almost poignant way that he wasn't satisfied with reigning intellectual paradigms about the founding. He went out to look for something better. He didn't get any help. The books that he did find that might have been helpful, he found long, tedious books of abstract complexity. Here I find a little whiff of the anti-intellectualism that I find self-defeating. I mean, there might have been scholarly sources out there, but they're kind of too hard, and a congressman couldn't read them on the run, and so that would really be too hard, and he wanted to provide us something easier. Well, I'm here to say there's not an easy route. To deconstruct the reigning left liberal intellectual framework is hard intellectual work, and a list of quotes is not going to really be of that much help. So I sympathize with Brother Skousen's predicament, and I admire his effort to a degree. But I would say that Glenn Beck can do better than the 5,000-year leap. He could call us to something a little more challenging. There is a deep and rich conservative tradition, a conservative intellectual tradition from which to draw. we do not have to choose between being left liberal and being smart. In fact, if we are serious about conservatism, we need to study diligently to increase our confidence that our intense feelings are common sense, as Beck refers to it. We need to increase our confidence intellectually that there is much worth preserving in a traditional, non-progressive ideal of America, that these feelings can be rationally articulated and defended, that the left liberal intellectual mainstream can be shown not to have the best arguments. I conclude with these words from the introduction to a book of LDS General Authority readings on the American founding, Just and Holy Principles. This from the introduction. To defend the principles of the Constitution under circumstances where the iniquity of the people has torn it to shreds might well require inspiration and wisdom equal to that of the generation raised up to found it. That is the challenge that I see.
All right, where do I begin? Throw me a bone. How many here have Brother Paul's Mormon Bathroom Reader? Please give me some encouragement. No hand but my wife's. Oh, Harold has it, okay. Hey, I am delighted to be here, and I thank each of you for enduring our efforts to try and get to some good points, and I believe some great points have been shared. I'll try to address a few of those. And I invite questions and whatnot, and maybe we'll be able to do more of that as we go on. Strange thing, about 7 years ago, Alan Keyes arrived in town. He went to the UVU to give a presentation. Thousands were there. I don't know if any of you perchance were there, but they were there to welcome him and this great new, perhaps rising star in the conservative world. And there's some heavyweights, political heavyweights from Utah who are also there. So here comes Senator Hatch up to the stage and applause, and he waves and he sits down. And then along comes Governor Leavitt. And, well, a smattering of applause. He was not as well liked. It's probably best he headed back to D.C. or elsewhere. And then along came my dad, and the place exploded in applause, and they jumped to their feet. There was an ovation that went for several long minutes. Dad waved, he thanked them, he sat down, and they continued to clap. Why? You know, what was it that made people love and appreciate his life of service? So growing up in that household, it was really interesting. Dad had this message that he pounded into, well, he didn't pound into us. He just said it over and over and over. And he said, if you don't ask the question, you'll never hear the answer. And that didn't mean anything to me. Okay, thanks, Dad. Good, yeah. And so as I got older, I started to ask some questions, and I found out that yeah, Dad had been giving me answers my whole life. Dozens, hundreds of times he had told me the same thing. I wasn't looking for it. If you don't ask the question, you're not going to hear the answer. And so that was how Dad was during his whole life. He asked lots of questions, and he would ask hard questions. Why is Jesus hanging there on the cross all dirty and bloody? What does that do? Explain that to me. Everybody says it pays for something, but explain that to me. Explain that to me in terms of the Book of Mormon, Alma 34. It says, no man can die for the sins of another. What's he doing? That doesn't make sense. So he got an apostle of the Lord to walk him through that and understand the atonement, because he asked the questions. So over the course of Dad's career, asking those questions, he had a great discipline. He would dig down as deeply as he could into any particular subject and try to uncover what it was, distill it, translate it so he could share it back with other people so they could understand. And of course, he got criticism for that, for being a little perhaps too easy, too soft, too sophomoric, or not intellectual enough. But that was not his intent. An example is the 5,000-year leap. he went through law school looking for the principles upon which the Constitution was founded. What are they? Can you identify them, point at them? Does it have to be so complex? We have to go through tons of schooling to figure it out? Can't we boil it down? So when he found out that the answer was no, we haven't boiled it down in all of these classes, then Dad decided, okay, I'm going to have to find it. So he spent his years trying to dig and dig and dig and came up with what he thought were the 28 great ideas upon which good government is founded. He stopped at 28 because he said that's when the founders began to repeat themselves, once they repeated those 28 ideas. So he wrote those up as best he could and put it out in the form of a book and tried to distill it down so the average person who's asking that question, what are the principles, could have a book they could turn to. And it wasn't, it didn't go miles down on any one of these subjects, but it just summarized each of them generally, so there was a framework. So the average person could make sense of what was going on. That was the same approach he took with his other books. The Naked Communist was his first national bestseller he had. And as Dr. Midgley mentioned, there's a divergence of opinions on the quality or the writing of that book. But after he wrote it, it was published in 1958. A copy was sent to the FBI for their analysis. And just one comment. A review, this is an official FBI memo that's kind of summarizing that particular book. And this is what that FBI memo says. A review of this book, The Naked Communist, by the Domestic Intelligence Division reflected the book was well written and it clearly pointed out the communist threat to the free world. It incorporated in one volume many aspects of communism, including communist theories, the lives of communist leaders, brutality of communism in its march for world conquest, failures of the free world's fight against communism, and fallacies of communism, and suggestions on how to fight communism in the crucial period between now and 1970. So that was the FBI's assessment of this book. And Dad's attempt was to once again distill what the best things he could find down to something the rest of us could understand and read without getting too lost, and give an overview. So that theme of his, ask the question so you can go hear the answer, is what led him through these different books. So for those of you not very familiar with him, he delved into other great subjects, the Old Testament, the 1,000-Year series, same story. So yes, I recognized, Dad recognized, but he was trying to provoke people's thinking. Start looking and don't just be like the sheep that we think maybe Glenn Beck has corralled with his radio show and TV show. Think about these things. Here's one perspective. And Dad's invitation always was, if someone can do it better, please do. But until then, this is what I've been able to do. And it wasn't the end. You come home to Dad's house up there on Berkeley Street and go down and see multiple copies of each of his books. He's in there crossing out things, and he's crossing and he's adding new things all the time. So he liked to view himself as being a student. Another thing he shared with me was that he frequently would use others as the sources. And he tried to be real careful with that, where he could have good references in his different books. So if you wanted to attack Dad, you were really attacking Brigham Young or Jefferson or someone else. And some might disagree with how he used that, but that was what he tried to do to give his writings as much credibility as possible. So a main message that Dad carried through all of his works and writings was one of hope. that the Lord's not being fooled. The Lord knows exactly what we're doing, what we're going through, what we need to do. And when he dug down deep into the scriptures and started to try to pull together these scattered references about this, our day, then he wrote this little book called Prophecy in Modern Times and tried to put the different prophecies in order as best as he could figure out so that we would know that the Lord's been telling his prophets all the way along. This is where we're headed. Don't fear. There's a way out. But if you don't repent, the nation will undergo a cleansing. And then comes all those nasty latter-day prophecies that none of us like to read. But in the end, there is hope. So that's probably one of the differences between Dad and Glenn Beck. Glenn works hard to stir up a passion about messages. And I don't know if you want to call it fear or scare, perhaps. Dad prefers offering solutions and saying, you know, there is a way out, but we can't do it ignorantly, and we can't do it just following one another. We honestly need to research it and study it out ourselves. And if any of us get wayward and don't get it straight, others who are studying, they're needed. Those voices need to be heard to bring them back. So that's probably about the best opening thought I can give, considering some of those issues that Dad brought and that made him perhaps, well, not perhaps, it did. It gave him a great reputation. He gave about 15,000 talks over the course of his life. He's written close to 40 books and taught 2 or 3 million people seminars on the Constitution and spoke to about 20 million over the course of all these years. Were Dad here today, I think he would enjoy visiting with Glenn Beck. I think his counsel would be, you gotta give us some more answers. Before Dad passed away, he was aware that Beck was pushing the 5,000-year leap, and he was grateful for that, but he didn't listen to the program more than 2 or 3 times. He was not a talk radio fellow. I think that just about summarizes things. So let me turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Paul. Well said. And let's go back to the original order and just give each panelist who wants to just a minute or two to respond to what else he's heard now.
Well, let's see. I don't know how to begin exactly. I don't want to give the impression that, and I thought about that as after I had talked and after they had talked, that somehow I was defending Cleon Skousen. That's not what I would want to do. I disagree with Skousen on a lot of things. But I was trying to differentiate in terms of tone between Skousen and Glenn Beck. I mean, Glenn Beck is I think quite different. But I think the whole atmosphere about political discourse has changed since Cleon Skousen's time. I don't think it's quite as simple as looking at the Constitution and the history of the Constitution and then trying to distill it for people. But clearly, Cleon Skousen had a particular strong ideology that was embedded in all of what he wrote in terms of politics, and in that sense, when you take things through that prism, it's so easy to discard what you don't agree with or what you don't think is correct, and not to present, I think, a more balanced kind of view. And my sense of what Skousen wrote is that there isn't that kind of balance, because his intent was to push a particular ideology, and also to connect that to LDS doctrine and to suggest that this is all interwoven together. And certainly President McKay's endorsement would support that, but my view was that's President McKay's personal endorsement, and that I think is not an indication that we need to suggest that Cleon Skousen's writings are LDS political doctrine. In fact, I think one of the fallacies of our political culture is that we have allowed Cleon Skousen and those on the right to kind of dominate LDS political writing and to suggest that that's all there is to our thought about politics, and that's clearly not the case. It's not church doctrine, even though there is an attempt to connect those two. I mean, you look at Skousen, and it's just replete with that kind of suggestion, in my view, that he is being endorsed by the church, that this is the political view of the church, and certainly the fact that President Benson was the president of the church for a while reinforced that sense. But again, this is all personal political views of some people, a group in the church, and there are many others in the church who feel differently, and they can as much claim to have that ideology be LDS doctrine as Cleon Skousen did to have his views as being LDS doctrine.
Another crack, Louis?
You want me to? Well, I'm glad that Paul is here. We've had an interesting little conversation before this started. There's a fellow by the name of Alexander Zeitschritt that is a freelance journalist. Some of you may have seen something that he did on the relationship, what he thinks is the relationship between Beck and Paul's father. He's contacted me because he's looking for dirt everywhere, and he thinks I have some dirt on Paul's father. In the criticism I made of that was published years ago, and I hate to admit it, I published in Dialogue of all places, but you live and learn. But anyway, that little package of essays that was published in Dialogue, I think, talked Cleon out of pushing this patently absurd idea that there are bankers that run the world. There are bankers that run the world, and by darn, they go under like everybody else because there are other things going on besides simply what goes on in boardrooms and banks. Now, if you don't know about that, you haven't been paying attention to this world. And to think that to start, you might as well think that bacteria on Alpha Centauri run the world. It begins to stray into that territory. And after this book called The Naked Capitalist, he switched to talking about the Constitution and that sort of thing, and had a little enterprise down off the campus for a while. And then he joined up with the Moonies and went around, and whatever his differences with them, they were close enough, and they gave him an audience and whatnot. So he left Provo and went on the hustings with that. And he was good with audiences. He was at the time, I was a young guy just out of graduate school and coming along, and I looked at him and I thought, well, he's sort of grandfatherly, and I don't know how much older he was than I was, but he had a very good style and approach with students and with audiences, adult audiences. They loved to hear him, and he was effective in selling a product. This got him into trouble because he would sell them in chapels, and he came close to getting excommunicated over that. I'll tell a story. In our department, we had a very close friend of Paul's father. This is Richard Vetterly. And some of us had heard this rumor that he was in trouble with the brethren. And so we asked Richard, and he said, I'll call him. And I stood there. Several of us stood there. He called him, and he said, I came very close, but I explained it was my associates who had done this, and so on and so forth, and escaped discipline from the church. And there are people. This is common. You think, well, I just get myself into a chapel, and then I set up my booth outside and sell my product. But when he got with the Moonies, he wasn't doing that any longer. He didn't do that. And of course, it helps to be able to get through to the secretary of the president of the church and have her, do her work. With the recent biography of President McKay, you'll understand the dynamics of that. Now, that may be eye-opening to you, but there were some of the brethren didn't like any of it. Harold B. Lee used to say, "When I think of Brother Skousen, I say BS." You've heard that.
I've heard that.
Yeah. And a lot of people have heard it. Well, that meant that that's just the way it is in the church. There are different points of view. And the idea that there's one point of view and only one. But look, the interesting thing here is on political matters, I'm slightly to the right of Chester A. Arthur. I'm far too much of a conservative in the modern sense of conservative, or classical liberal in the older sense, the founding. I'm far too far in that direction for Richard's taste on these matters. I can't stand the welfare state. Much of what goes on bothers me, a great deal. So I'm not an advocate.
He donates all these things, Eric. Come on. The other welfare state.
Yeah. Yeah, all the single mothers that we've created with it, and all the rest. That's sort of the thing.
Thought, Eric, and we'll get to
Yeah. So and the idea of trying to figure out I have a very high regard for the founding. For 20 years, once or twice a year, I taught the Federalist Papers or Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. I don't know whether those classes are still being taught.
Yes, mostly.
No, well,
I teach Tocqueville.
well, but you see, I wanted to be up on the most current literature. I wanted the best scholarship. I didn't want to argue from simply collecting statements, nice-sounding paragraphs that you could drop into a book that made people feel good. I wanted them to understand the arguments. And I didn't. What I objected to Paul's father with is I didn't see the arguments being dealt with, even after he gave up the conspiracy theory business.
Thank you, Louis. Paul, I feel, shall I give you 30 seconds on the excommunication question?
If you want to, real quick. No, Dad was never in trouble with the brethren. He was always in good standing with the church. There were members of his family, someone who had some difficulties. Sometimes that story gets confused with my dad. But no,
You mean a son-in-law?
no, Max. His brother Max, yeah.
No. I haven't mind another.
Okay, that's all. All right. But no, Dad is fine. He was in good standing. The brethren loved him, and he was just fine.
Yeah, let me. I sympathize with Brother Skousen's, Cleon's situation in law school in, I gather, in the 50s. I can see that it might have been very difficult to find, it still is not so easy to find in law schools, a substantial discussion. What passes for constitutional law is very much shaped by a progressive tradition, which tends to be indifferent to the founder's understanding of the Constitution. So I sympathize with his plight. And here, I've almost forgot that I'd brought some handouts and some show and tell to fall back on here. But I wanted to make the case that whatever the situation was in 1958 or whenever Cleon Skousen's quest began, and even the conservative intellectual movement was gathering steam at that time under William F. Buckley and National Review. There were a lot of intellectually interesting things happening at that time that didn't fall within the purview of Brother Skousen in the way that I think it would have been better still if they had. But I've brought some free presents for anybody interested. Reading the Right Books, A Guide for the Intelligent Conservative by Lee Edwards. It's not my list, it's not perfect, but it's, I think it would take you to a horizon beyond what you might gather from Brother Skousen's work. There are fairly accessible books for the layman that don't require years of graduate study to understand. And again, these are endorsements, but they're not unqualified. It doesn't mean that one can't reasonably disagree with any of these and that I might not disagree. But Vindicating the Founders, this is not to take, but this is show and tell. Race, Sex, Class, and Justice in the Origins of America. Very accessible and lively book by Thomas West. In Search of the Republic by this Richard Vetterli named and Gary Briner, colleagues at BYU. This is a monumental and seldom noticed treasure. The American Constitution, a constitutional history deeply, richly annotated and with bibliographic apparatus that is virtually inexhaustible. Kelly, Harbison, and Herman Belts. 2 volumes, dispassionate, even-handed, but if you want to learn how to criticize what the Constitution has become in relation to an original understanding, this is like a library compressed into 2 volumes. There are extremely intelligent authors of impeccable scholarship who agree with Glenn Beck that we are in times where the threat of tyranny is something to be taken seriously. Paul Ray, a classical historian, Soft Despotism. This is a man, he's also got a trilogy, Republic, Ancient and Modern. This man knows everything from Plato down through the American founding and Tocqueville. And he's written a book about a dangerous drift toward despotism in contemporary welfare state democracies. You couldn't find a more reputable scholarly source. He might not be right about everything, but he's very, very smart, and he's not just listing sources, he's making a sustained argument. Here's something easier, Roots of Freedom by John Danford. Lighter, freshman or sophomore level. You could read it in an evening, but it's sound, and it's solid. And it's a good consecutive argument. Another free handout. The Claremont Institute is a constitutionalist institute in Claremont, California. Look at their website. They have another website called thefounding.com. Great resources there. There's an essay, The Rise and Fall of Constitutional Government in America, that maps out the critique of progressive constitutionalism and raises profound questions about it in a publicly accessible way in 30 pages or 38 pages. Things to take a look at that I believe are superior alternatives to the kind of proof texting, quote listing approach that too many Latter-day Saints stop with. Whether on balance it's better that Cleon's books exist than that they don't, I'm agnostic on that question. I'm open to the possibility that they should exist. But I wish they would point a little more beyond themselves to this literature that is more substantial and sound and teaches us how to do battle with a certain intellectual mainstream in a more substantial and coherent way. Yeah, I know, those little ISA guides. Yeah. Do you want another minute? Because I just gave you 30 seconds on the, or shall we just open it up to the audience?
Yeah, we can probably open it up. Yeah, I was going to respond to a couple things, but maybe we're running out of time, so we ought to open it up.
Kristen, do you mind being the MC at this point? And if it works and if convenient, you can pass the mic around. We'd like to see you running back and forth anywhere.
Just do you want to do the order?
No, you're in charge now.
Oh man, let's go here first.
All right, I just jotted down a few notes while I was listening to you. bash Glenn Beck a little bit. But I wanted to make a few points, and I'm sympathetic to your argument, the arguments that you guys made up there. First off, I was, sorry, I forgot, your name's a little odd, the one next to you. It starts with an M, I think. Sorry. The argument that you gave with liberal versus conservative, I was well aware of that before because I had written papers on it, and I think the reason they stick with the term conservative today is that liberal has such a negative connotation with it and has changed meaning over time. I mean,
this is the problem with appealing to people with little sound bites and this, that, and the other.
right.
This is the problem with politics. What Ralph wants is intelligent argument and discourse among citizens, and not simply slogan.
Well, I'm getting to that point. Is that those terms were taken? They were even written in Marx's Communist Manifesto as "We are the liberals, we are the progressives," and gradually, over time, the meaning had changed. Even though liberal was a good meaning, now Glenn Beck and others adopt the conservative term because that's what the general public. They see liberal as a progressive movement or as a socialist movement. That's exactly. I mean, that's exactly how I was raised to believe it, and I imagine, and I learned that from the media and the general public. So, you know, I believe you're right in the argument. But the points that I wanted to make about, you know, saying that Glenn's show's full of insults, I think you should watch the show more. He does have. Well, he does insult just like anybody else. I mean, if you ever watch Keith Olbermann and Rachel Maddow, you want to see some insults, watch that show. But right. Right. Well, and so I think what I want to get to is I think Glenn Beck is very sincere. Whether you agree with him or not, I no. Well, I'm trying to get to the point why I think he's sincere is because if you listen to the media, the conservative talk show hosts, Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity, over time they've been what does the Republican Party do? What are the Democrats doing? They're opposing the Republican Party. They were on a partisan platform. Glenn Beck, when I first started listening to him a long time ago, was just like that. And over time, he's come full circle to be more of a conservative and actually opposes a lot of what the Republicans say. So that's why I believe that he's sincere, because Sean Hannity and Rush Limbaugh have not done that. They're still partisans. You watch Karl Rove or you watch Newt Gingrich on TV, they're always saying why the Democrats are wrong, why the other party is wrong. So I would say, in answer to your question, sorry, I didn't get all the names in the beginning, that you were wondering if he's sincere. I personally believe he's sincere, and I think that's why he's so appealing to the general public. And the last point that I want to make is intellectualism is boring to the general public, and that's why Glenn Beck's arguments aren't intellectual. That's what. Well, but.
And then we get what we deserve when we get Congress and the president and the state legislature.
Well, but can any of you name any main public? This is the question. Any of you name any main public figure that is renowned in the media? There's Olbermann, there's Hannity, there's Limbaugh, there's all those. Does any famous figure in the media argue from an intellectual perspective? Sure. I'm talking media figures, not people who show up. No, I'm not.
Charles Krauthammer.
But these people are not talk show hosts. They're commentators on a show like Bill Kristol or Charles Krauthammer. There's any of the talk show hosts that run their own show, none of them argue from an intellectual perspective. So the point I want to make is it's more about getting ratings than it is about, and it's trying to inspire a movement. I mean, John Locke said, don't poke holes in my argument, just take it as a whole. And I think that's what they're trying to do with Glenn Beck and with these other talk show hosts. They're trying to inspire movements rather than be intellectual.
Good
That's
point.
all I have to say.
You want to take a crack at that, Richard?
Not really, no.
Yeah, but I don't know if that's kind of a damning by faint praise, saying they're doing what they have to do. And look, there are constraints. We're in a difficult situation where the loudspeakers of media entertainment Keith Olbermann versus Glenn Beck, let's say, and I'll take Glenn Beck every time. I don't mind saying that. But there's a risk that we'll just get more and more divisive argument/entertainment in a way that will really prevent us from coming to terms with what's at stake and finding our way out of a situation that you might wish is simple, but it's not. It takes some intellectual acumen to figure out where we are and what to do about it.
I think the listening is awful. Because it wasn't that long ago that William F. Buckley was a talk show host. And he was deeply intellectual. He could command an audience for an hour on a deep intellectual topic. It was very conservative. And we would sit and watch it. But today the audience is, I mean, everybody has some kind of ADD and they won't listen to a sustained audience for more than 2 minutes.
Yeah. You have to remember that Buckley, as I recall, was on public television. Yeah, well, public television doesn't make money. And that's the difference is political, because of the fragmentation of the media, we now have a segment of the media that is primarily political, but it's still not geared towards intellectuals. I mean, like public radio or public television is.
This question is for Brother Skousen. Do you feel that your father's popularity was due to a lot of the, I guess, deeper stuff that he wrote about church doctrine? Because I just remember I disagree a lot with what he wrote. No disrespect to you. And on my mission, I came across that talk, "The True Meaning of the Atonement," and I midway through it, I just put it down because I thought it was, well, trash. Just a lot of it. I didn't feel it was. He used scripture, but I didn't feel that. At the same time, I didn't feel that it was doctrinally sound. Do you feel that his popularity stems from that, from a lot of the deep stuff that he wrote about the church, not just his political views?
Thanks so much. It's hard to say. He was an excellent communicator, and when he delivered a message, it brought a great spirit. People felt it, and clarity came, and that could be on politics or that could be on religion. But once again, that original point I was making, if you were wondering and curious, then suddenly it starts clicking and making sense. I personally think that's why that was the key. A lot of people are looking for substance, and they're not getting it. They're just getting fluff off the media. They're not getting real answers in places. And so that's how Dad felt. And he tried to answer those, and I think he hit a huge welcome among a lot of people of different faiths. He was frequently asked in other speeches, what religion are you? And he said, well, what religion do you think I am? Well, you sure sound like a Baptist. That's what we believe. He's taught. I think that's what people like. I think that's why he became so popular. And we talk about intellectualism. We should talk deeper, et cetera, et cetera. Well, fine. We got to have a framework to start with. Otherwise, people get lost, like some of those leaving right now.
Patrice will get you next. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry. I guess my question's for Professor Hancock and Professor Midgley, even though everybody can answer, I suppose. I think, Professor Hancock, you said that the actual work of presenting an intellectual argument is hard. I think is exactly what you said. And generally, I think that's not working out the specifics and how things work is generally not a public role. But I see the importance of that, is having that intellectual emphasis. But I think that's for y'all to do. I'm from Texas, sorry. I think that's something that for y'all or the public representatives that the public votes for is to do the hard things that generally your father, he wasn't really trying to do. He's just trying to generate interest. And I think that's important, but it's not the end. And what I think gets lost and what the intellectual community is so upset about is that that's exactly where it stops. So we stop with the Cleon Skousen books and the Glenn Beck books and the Sean Hannity books that really offer no solutions to our problems governmentally or ideologically or whatever, but do provide a framework that is important for other people that are more qualified to do that, for them to be chosen. And so I guess my question is, what's the next step after the framework I suppose, is instituted, you know, to where we make sure that we do have a very legitimate, I guess, frame or policy decision like that.
I'll take a crack at. I mean, you raise a huge set of questions, and let me just say that I think a lot depends precisely on the relationship, the interplay between publicists, even entertainer publicists, and thinkers and scholars. And one way of defining our problem is that the mediation between the two has broken down. I would regard on the conservative side, George Will or Bill Kristol, different kinds of conservatives, might be two sorts of very qualified mediators between the two realms, but their audience is cut into hugely by Glenn Beck and Sean Hannity and so forth. But if you don't have this mediation, if you don't have the linkages in the chain between the most careful and painstaking thought and the verging on sloganeering that is alleged to provide a framework, see, that's just not an adequate. You say we need a framework, but I don't think Brother Skousen or Glenn Beck can provide an adequate framework. Getting a framework is the hardest thing. Lewis, do you want to take a credit? Lewis was invited to.
No.
Okay.
Okay.
Like what I said?
Okay. That framework actually, I think, is well there. The 5,000-year leap, some of these others get you started. The next book Dad did, The Making of America, he takes the 287 principles in the Constitution. He breaks it down to that many points and principles and lets the founders describe to you what each of those are. And so that you can understand that this thing we like to say, we support the Constitution, actually does have ideas that have been narrowed down to something much more finite that we can grab and look at and discuss. There's a framework for you for understanding a lot of the other talk that surrounds it. That's all.
My comment's actually pretty similar to the last one. I think it's pretty First off, I just want to comment on your seating arrangements. I like how Dr. Davis is on the left and Brother Skousen is hanging off the right. I don't know if that was on purpose.
I thought you were on the right.
This is the French part. We think in terms of politics with left and right.
The French Parliament dating back to
We
the.
think in terms of the seating arrangement in the French Parliament.
So
About the level of understanding in the popular mind in newspaper reporters and talk people on television. Go ahead.
I understand the history behind the left and right. Yeah. What I'm going to say is that I think it's fairly easy for a group of intellectuals so-called intellectuals to sit here and criticize Glenn Beck, but I can guarantee you that there are far more BYU students who are listening to Glenn Beck right now than are sitting in this room. And my point is, if you guys have the better arguments, then make the arguments. Instead of sitting here and criticizing Cleon Skousen and Glenn Beck has 3.1 million people who watch him every day.
Take my class.
I am, with 5 other people. There are 6 people in that class. And so what I'm saying is, if you have the arguments,
Rather than solid understanding.
and that's easy to sit back and criticize other people and say, oh, it's because they're more entertaining. But if your arguments actually win out in the end, then make those arguments in a way that's interesting to people. Because arguments can win. You just have to present them in a way that's not painfully boring to read, like half the stuff that we have to read in that class. So I'm saying, I love the class, Dr. Hancock. It's my favorite class I've ever taken at BYU, by far. So what I'm saying, I'm challenging you guys to make the arguments in a way that matters, that will force people to listen because they are both right and because they're interesting.
I'm just a little more skeptical about forcing people to listen, that's all.
Glenn Beck forces people to listen because people are talking about it. And so people have to pay attention if you want to know what's going on in the world.
If I could just differentiate myself from the criticism of the masses, I mean, I think that I agree that there is the kind of argumentation that Glenn Beck makes, and I think Cleon Skousen makes, although to a lesser extent, is designed for a mass audience, which is not terribly well informed. That is a dilemma. Not informed about politics and government in the way that we're trying to get them to. No, I'm not insulting either one. I say there's a connection there. He is attempting to explain his views about politics to them. They are typically already in agreement with him on much of that, so it's reinforcing what they want to hear, what they believe. There's nothing wrong with that. We all do that to a great extent. I think that you, however, as students, can see the problem here, and hopefully can see the problem, and are not quite the same as those who don't understand politics, because you've been in political science classes. You should know more what a good argument is, and not say, oh, Glenn Beck is providing my political information for me. But you can go beyond that to something else. In fact, I mean, I don't listen to Glenn Beck. I don't listen to Rachel Maddow. I don't listen to Keith Holberman. I don't like any of them because they're at this, they appeal to emotion and to a level of argument that I think doesn't help people at all. But nevertheless, there is a role there, and that's our challenge as academics, is to try to reach out to an audience of students who are listening to Glenn Beck and at some other institution listening to Keith Olbermann, and believing that that's the way in which you discuss and debate politics. And our mission, I think, is to say that's not quite the case. I think we can do better than that. That's why I was pointing out the general authorities talks. They're trying to do the same thing. They're trying to say that's not how we should interact as LDS political citizens.
He made this point earlier. He made this point earlier with a just released 70, asking us for civility, right? Yes. And calm conversations, not insults and not blatant expressions of emotion and so on. And I think that was aimed at our dialogue with our conversations with probably 5-point Calvinists out of the Southern Baptist Convention or something like that, following Romney getting Huckabeed. But that can apply right across right over into the political discussions. And it should, and Richard is absolutely right about that, and you should be learning it here. If you're attracted to the violent, if you're attracted to something that isn't providing you with solid information, that half the time isn't true, or isn't true in a way that is genuinely concerned about people that are on the other side, that seems to appear, then something's wrong with us. We should get past that.
Thank you, Patrice. You don't seem to have noticed all the praise I gave Glenn Beck, and he actually came off better than Brother Skousen in what I just had to say. I actually noticed some solid consecutive argument in this book, and there's some things that are quite stirring. I think he's concerned about some real things that I'm really concerned about. But look, there is a difference between, the classical way of putting it is between argument and rhetoric, or let's say philosophy and rhetoric, and there has to be a place for both. Philosophy at some point has to try to be persuasive and reach a larger audience, but it's just possible that we're in a situation where the better arguments are unlikely to prevail against those that are most entertaining or gratifying or whatever the case may be. Now, I hope not, and if I can do anything to was it President Benson who used to say to make popular that which is good? One of our presidents did. If I can do anything to help make popular that which is good, I'll keep trying to find ways, and I do have classes with 150 students or so. By the way, they're not all as selective as the present, even more in the olden days. Yeah, Okay, but we've got, who's got the microphone out there? Well, look, people, we get paid, we have the room until 1/2 anyway, but you get paid the same now, unless you're Professor Davis' student, and then you must stay until the room is empty, but other than that.
We're on overtime, though, aren't we?
Oh.
For our pay?
Oh, yeah, we are on, okay, I have to pay you more. Well, that went fast. So I'm having fun, I don't mind, but I certainly, you all want to hear what Professor Henderson is going to say.
Yeah, if Professor Davis is the
Hendrickson.
left, we have something to add here. I actually find it interesting as more of a student of the left who has studied much of sort of the struggles between the Fabians and the Marxists in Europe in the late 19th century, and see people like George Bernard Shaw plead with the Marxists to say, can you come up with a better argument other than let's kill the king? Right? Can we come up with something that's going to actually, you know, pass weights and maybe, you know, become law? Where the Beckites, there you go, are saying he doesn't care about the Republicans, he just cares about conservatism. This idea of ideological purity being more important than the party, more important than governance.
More important getting elected.
More important than getting elected, which is relatively important in our system when it comes to governance. On the left, we did that for a long time. And if you want to do what the Democrats did in the 60s, through the 90s, I don't know if that's a great idea, a great approach to take. I'm all for the right doing that. It works well for me. But at the same time, when we look at sort of ideology above the common good, I think that's ultimately where the communists made a mistake. It wasn't because they read too much Marx, but because they were willing to put ideology above humanity, and horrible things happened. So for people like Beck, who are willing to say ideology over party, I think that's going to have negative consequences that might work out well for me, but I don't know if that's a great strategy to follow.
Go hand it to Brother Kramer there, and that was Marx's fault, by the way.
I'm going to say something that goes to a past, you know, that's beyond where you are. Anybody here ever heard of Milton Friedman? You have. How about that? How could that possibly be? Why do you think you've heard about Milton Friedman?
A successful mediator, wasn't he?
Well, Milton Friedman was brilliant, extremely brilliant. He was an intellectual by nature. He was an intellectual by profession. Even his mediating arguments are difficult to follow. Go ahead and read Capitalism and Freedom, and see what you can find. But what do you suppose Ronald Reagan did? Ronald Reagan's bookshelves were filled with political philosophy. Every week when he created his weekly radio address, he wasn't thinking about whether or not he had an audience. He was thinking about whether or not he was having an influence on the direction America was taking. And he drew his ideas from people like Milton Friedman. He cared enough about the country that he decided he was going to have to do that kind of work if someone was going to be able to take the country in a particular direction. So part of my point is, you know, my U of C connections are a little bit too open here, University of Chicago with Friedman, but no, it makes a big difference. People who think well and people who have strong ideas and are able to communicate those ideas effectively to people whose minds change and whose minds change enough that they really want to get involved and they really do want big things to happen. It always seems to me that that it has to move well beyond some of the things that make us feel good about our political positions, instead of things that move us to be involved in a world that we have some control over and that we can change. And it would be very disappointing to me if young Latter-day Saints ultimately believed that it was more important to have other people be involved in this kind of thinking and in this kind of work, and ultimately in creating a society where things that are true matter. And Latter-day Saints, above anybody else, has a responsibility to work to build a society where things that are true matter, and that we take them seriously. And so, you know, we do our little jobs over in a little corner, and we visit with our students and that sort of thing. But it does matter. It makes a difference. And we sort of hope you don't just dismiss this as, you know, talk by empty-headed people who can't always get the right colored socks, you know. But it's part of it. It's part of the whole thing. And let's make sure that we don't love simple things because they're simplistic, not because they're simply true. There's a difference.
Thank you. Professor Kramer, I'm willing to let that stand as a conclusion. I couldn't do better. So at this point, I'm also willing to, if people really want to talk more, this is what I do for kicks. So I would be happy to talk some more. But at this point, I think I would like to thank my friends and colleagues for their participation. Thank all of you for coming. Ask you to show your thanks, if you would, for my guests. And with that conclusion, anybody who wants to stay seated here may do so, and many will need to leave. Others, if you want to come forward, if there are a few left, I will be left as well.